Now, what is the appropriate response to a country which succeeds in murdering a British citizen on board a British-run ship in international waters? Well, a British national was one of two people killed when a drone swarm attacked the MV, the merchant vessel Mercer Street, Japanese-owned, but managed by a London-based company with links to Israel off the coast of Oman. The air raid happened at 3 a.m. on Thursday last week. After one drone landed close to the ship, at least one unmanned aerial vehicle packed with explosives hit the bridge of the oil tanker and exploded in the ship's living quarters. A Romanian died along with the British national, who was believed to be a maritime security guard. Well, a third of all the world's oil passes along the international waters of the Gulf every day. The Foreign Office blames the Iranians, as do the Americans. But even though these two deaths are the first fatalities of their kind, observers say there is little likelihood of Iran facing a military response from Britain, at least. But there was a tweet. UK believes the attack on MV Mercer Street was carried out by Iran and was deliberate, targeted and unlawful. The UK calls on Iran to immediately cease actions that risk regional and international peace and security. Well, let's turn to Nile Gardiner, director of the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Niall, so good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for your time this evening.
My pleasure, Colin. Thank you.
I just wonder whether the lady would have responded with a tweet or whether perhaps there might have been something a little more muscular to this outrage.
Well, I think Lady Thatcher would have responded very strongly and robustly to this latest act of terror by the Iranian regime. You can't just respond with tweets. You have to respond with real force against the world's biggest state sponsor of international terror. And this latest terror attack by Iran took the life of a British citizen. Iran must pay the price for that. And we also have to deter further attacks from happening. And while almost certainly I think we're going to see Israeli retaliation in the wake of this barbaric attack, we should also see US and British military action taken directly against Iran and those responsible for this attack. If we don't take this kind of action, we're going to see many more attacks by Iran. We're going to see more loss of British life, and that is unacceptable. We have to stand up to this brutal tyranny in Tehran and send a very clear message that there are consequences for this kind of terrorist activity.
But a response like that, Niall, requires the military wherewithal to deliver it. In America, where you are, the surface fleet of the United States Navy is something like getting on for 500 ships, 500 vessels. The surface fleet of the Royal Navy, much diminished from what it was, is now 18 ships, perhaps 19, but certainly no more than 20, of which at least a third are currently in dock. It's one thing to say we will do something, quite another to actually do something.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Colin. And without a doubt, any military action would have to be a joint US-British operation. It would be very difficult for the UK, of course, to do this operation on its own, but it could do so in coordination with Washington. And I think there are, a number of potential targets here. You could target the Revolutionary Guard authorities that commanded this operation. President Trump took devastating action against the leadership of the Revolutionary Guards not too long ago when he was the president, and that actually set Iran back very significantly. You could also, of course, target Iran's drone production facilities. You could also target the Iranian proxy organizations, terror movements operating inside Iraq and Syria and also Yemen as well. There are a number of potential military options here on the table. But if the US does indeed take action against Iran, Britain should certainly participate in that military action to send a very clear message to the Iranian regime that it is playing with fire.
You mentioned the drones, Niall. It's worth noting this point in the context of asymmetrical warfare. I mean, there is no question if it came to a straight fight, as it were, involving the United States and Iran, there's no question about who would be the winner. But when it comes to inflicting damage with relatively low-tech unmanned aerial vehicles, these drones that can have a warhead strapped to the nose cone and fired in the general direction of a ship, they can be absolutely devastating. Are we sure the Iranians, though, were behind it?
Without a doubt, of course, Iran was absolutely responsible for this attack, and Iran has been purchasing drones actually from China for several decades, and now actually also producing their own drones. And according to the Israeli defense minister today, he said that Iran had at least several hundred of these precision strike drones that they could use against international shipping, and the Israelis certainly are preparing for, I think, a military response here. But we have to stop Iran, certainly, from also the long-term threat that it poses to international shipping, but also to the entire Middle East region. And we have to destroy, frankly, Iran's drone-producing capability. We have to prevent them from having the capability to carry out these kinds of terror attacks in the future. And Iran understands only one message from the West, and that is a message of strength and resolve. This is an evil, barbaric dictatorship. We have to stand up to these brutal regimes and send a very clear signal that there will be significant consequences for their actions. And we have to respond to the taking of a British life. That is unacceptable. There have to be consequences for Iran.
What do you say to those people, Niall, who will hear that and say, oh, come on, this is only so much warmongering? Yes, there are vital strategic interests in play. I mentioned in my introduction a third of the world's oil passes through the Gulf. But when it comes to military action, there are enemies that the Iranians have in the region, most obviously the Saudis. Let them deal with Iran. Let Israel deal with Iran. We don't need to get involved. We don't need blood on our hands.
Well, that's a good question. My response is that we're in the same fight that the Israelis are in, fighting against the world's biggest state sponsor of international terrorism. We must stand with our allies and fight against this threat and emphatically defeat this threat. And we have to stand up to these bullies like Iran, these terrorists who think they can just kill British citizens at will. No, they can't, actually. There has to be a price that this evil regime pays for it. And we have to stand full square with our friends and allies, especially with Israel, who are facing, without a doubt, an existential threat from the possibility of a nuclear-armed Iran. We have to prevent that from happening.
No, just one final point. How do we stop escalation? It's one thing, and people will understand the logic that says if a British life is taken in such a violent fashion, we have to make some kind of retaliatory action. However, this is a regime which is happy to ratchet things up. Suddenly we find ourselves in a race, a violent race of tit for tat, and we know not where it ends.
Well, I think that the evidence shows that when Iran is hit very hard, as they were actually under the Trump presidency, when President Trump took decisive action to take out the leader of the Revolutionary Guards, General Soleimani, that actually seriously dented Iran's ability to carry out terrorist attacks. And Iran's terrorist activity was dramatically slowed down. Now that you have a new administration in Washington, the Biden presidency, that is seen in Iran as much weaker, Iran is now ramping up its terrorist activity. And they sense weakness, certainly on the part of the West at the moment. We have to demonstrate to Iran that we are prepared to do what is necessary in order to emphatically take on one of the most brutal and barbaric dictatorships. So strong resolve, strong force against Iran does work. Iran does not have the overall long-term capability to conduct any kind of major conflict with the United States and the United Kingdom. If it was foolish enough to do so, it would certainly be heavily defeated. So decisive military action against Iran does work, and it certainly, I think, sends the right message to this barbaric regime.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.